Hi, my name is Aaron Kurz, and I'm a second-year DMA in piano performance studying with Anton Nell.
Well, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for coming, and we're really looking forward to your upcoming concerto competition. You won the concerto competition, and you're going to be playing a Prokofiev concerto.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about what are you going to be playing?
So I'll be playing Prokofiev's third piano concerto in C major. This is one of my favorite concertos to perform because it's a ton of fun, and there's so much that I think this piece shows. And I'm really excited to be playing with the UT Orchestra.
Yeah. So what made you pick this piece? Because you auditioned on this piece for this concerto competition,
Correct,
right?
yeah.
So what made you choose it?
Well, so this is a piece that I actually learned for the first time back in high school, a long time ago. And it was a piece that I'd played 4 or 5 years ago with orchestra as well, but I hadn't touched it in a while. And it's one of those pieces that, it's something that you actually use a lot in competitions for final rounds. So I always found myself whipping it back up, rushing however many week preparation of it so that it could be ready, but never really getting to sink into it. And I thought that this was a really nice time for me to go, okay, let's go back to square one. Let's rebuild some of this stuff. Let's rethink this. Because it's a great piece to perform. It's a great piece to compete with. And it's one of my favorite pieces. So you put all those together, and I had some time to actually work on it. And it was a really enlightening and fulfilling process, I think, bringing it back up.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because this is like standard rep, right?
It is
like
very standard.
Right?
One of the top 3 or 4 or 5 performed concertos,
this and like rock third. I mean, there's just some
and rock second. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So does that make it harder because like everybody's heard it and so many great, amazing pianists have played it to kind of find your own voice with it?
I think it doesn't. It doesn't. I'm someone who, when I'm learning a piece, I definitely look at and listen to recordings to hear, okay, what are the broad strokes? What do people generally do? But with pieces that I'm really actively working on, I kind of avoid it for that reason, right? Because first of all, I don't want my performance to be like an amalgamation of A from Horowitz, B from Rubinstein, so on and so forth, right?
First movement.
Right, exactly. I mean, there's definitely a pressure that like people have heard incredible performances of it, right? But I think for me, I just try to tune it out and go into it, what do I feel about this? Obviously you've subconsciously, I'm sure, digested every time you've heard it of the dozens of times I've heard the piece. But I just try to ignore it and do what feels right, especially when it's not in a competition format, especially when you're in a performance format. It makes it even easier to just go, okay, doesn't matter what anyone else does. What do I want to do here?
Yeah. And you played this in high school. That's pretty impressive.
I wouldn't say I played it well in high school, but I did. I learned it in high school, and I played it a little bit, yeah. But there's obviously, I mean, anything you do in high school, there's so many more levels that you can take it to once you're a more mature musician, right?
Yeah. Now, did you play it with like the high school orchestra? Or?
I played one movement with orchestra, and that was the first movement that got fairly seasoned relatively for the time, just because you play with orchestra, it gets better. But the second and third movements, I never really truly digested well, I'd say, until I performed the full thing for the first time with orchestra in 2021.
Okay, so in high school, you mainly just learned that first movement.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And how has your understanding of the piece changed then? Because that was what, 5-6 years ago?
Oh God, I wish. No, we're not even going to speak of that. It was a long time ago. No, I mean, I think that there's a certain process that you go through in high school, and it's a very different process that you go through when you're older. And I think that it has to be rebuilt, at least for me. Things that I learned early on, I think it's for me in high school I learned things with a very like sort of binary understanding in terms of like, I'm going to do this here, I'm going to do this here, I'm going to do this here. And it can come through for sure as a very professional performance. It can come through compellingly. But I think that, as I aged and as I kept learning, I feel like I have sought out more spontaneity in there. And it requires a different approach where things are perhaps more solid, but in a certain time, you're a little bit less rigid about, okay, before I'd be like, I need to crescendo exactly this bar, right? And that's what I'm thinking in the performance. So as I've brought it back this time, and then also the first time I brought it back in 2021, I think there's that search for spontaneity, that search for genuineness, and flexibility and freedom that I think is really hard to get as a 15, 16, 17-year-old musician for anyone. I think it's just, and it's a different process when you're older. I think it's more fulfilling because I'm like, okay, this is what I want to do, and I believe this because X, Y, Z. And now I get to do that because it's my choices and I have reasons to back it up. And And I think that that's really fulfilling. There's something very exciting about that, and having that freedom to where you believe in your own opinions more strongly now, right?
Yeah. Like, do you feel, it almost sounds like you feel like you didn't quite have the maturity level in high school to play it. Do you think that was a mistake to play it?
Not at all. No, I mean,
Okay.
I don't think I think it's just in high school, it's just a different maturity level for any piece. And I don't think any circumstances, certain pieces are harder, certain are easier, but I think it's just, I approach things differently now. And any piece would go through the same transformation, I think. And there's something exciting about that, I think, that you come back, you're like, okay, I don't have to really totally relearn these notes. They're there. You know, I go through, I rework some fingerings, obviously. But it's like, okay, now I can really focus on the musicality of it, on how I feel, on the genuineness of it. And that's something that I can do now that I felt like I just, as a musician, wasn't capable of doing maybe in high school.
Yeah, and for people who aren't familiar with the piece, talk a little bit about, you know, when we think of Prokofiev, we think of like flashy, I would say, right?
Of course,
like,
yeah.
Right, so talk a little bit about like more to this piece.
Yeah, so I think that this piece, as you said, it's a war horse. It's firmly in the canon. You hear it so many times. And I think what comes to mind first for a lot of listeners is the fireworks. It's the bombastic nature of the piece. And I think that's really fun and great as an audience member. But I think there's so much character in this piece that one has to be careful to make sure that it's brought out, that it's not just flash and fireworks, because there's a lot more depth to it. And I think there's always a risk that it just becomes explosives, right? I think the first movement has a lot of that. The second movement is a really gorgeous theme and variations that I think is really challenging in its own way. Perhaps the hardest movement to put together, because you have to tie all these variations together while also making them different. And then the third movement is sort of a return to that bombastic nature, that flash. But I think there's so much character in this piece, and that's something that I really try to bring out in my performance if I can, because no one wants to hear 30 minutes of boom, 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 look at my hands flying.
Yeah.
It's exciting, but I think there's a lot more to this piece than that. And that's what I would say to listen for. Listen for all those characters. That's what Prokofiev was great at, different characters. And I think that's really the staple of the piece more than anything.
So talk us through, like, you talked about the variations. So what are variations?
So for variations, so you have a theme, and then, you know, in the case of this concerto, I don't know, it probably goes on for a minute and a half. And then you have 5 variations on that. So then Prokofiev will take this theme and he will warp it. Each time there's some sort of different transformation. You know, the first variation is a little bit more song-like, a little bit more lyrical. The second one is more flashy, lots of scales, lots of staccato, more gymnastics, so to speak, acrobatics. The third, so on and so forth. We go through this whole flow. And the challenges as a performer is, how do I make each of these different, while at the same time, it's not, you know, 5, 6, 7 different little puzzle pieces. They also have to form the puzzle, right? So it's how does one lead to the other? How do you also create a long arc within the movement that tells a longer form story, not just a bunch of little vignettes, right?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. Is that what originally drew you to the piece, or like what was the magic that originally drew you to this piece? Do you remember listening to it for the first time?
I don't, honestly. I think my teacher suggested it and I listened, and and I enjoyed it. I think it was probably that simple. I don't know. But that's something that as I come back to it now, I think those moments are more special. And that's what I really enjoy about the piece, is just how many different sides. It's like almost like a mirror ball, right? There's like all these little different characters and you have to piece them all together, and it's a challenge, but I think it makes the piece really rewarding as a performer.
Okay, so you never went as a kid and saw this performed?
Oh, I did.
You did?
Surely many times. I just don't remember. I know I've heard it countless times, but I don't know. My memory of that stuff is fuzzy because it goes back far. So.
Yeah. So your parents took you to a lot of concerts?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we went to the Dallas Symphony a bunch growing up in Dallas. Sometimes over to Fort Worth. Saw the Clyburn a couple times. Yeah.
Yeah, the DFW is a big piano area in Texas.
A very big piano area. Yeah, there's a lot of great pianists that come through there, that have come out of there. So it's a really great area to grow up in as a musician.
So yeah, so you were going to some of these Clyburn. I'm sure you'd have heard it, multiple times.
Oh yeah.
So talk a little bit about you coming to the piano as a child.
Yeah, so I started really early. I think as early as age 2. So my mom played for me these. They were called Baby Mozart videos. I don't know if they still exist, but it's like little shapes and colors sort of floating around on the VHS tape with classical music in the background. And she played piano as a child, so we had a piano in the house that she I think occasionally played around with. And but so there was a piano there, and I would go to the piano after hearing these things and sort of apparently, so I've heard, sort of plunk out like a very basic skeleton of what I was hearing. And my mom was like, okay, maybe we should sign him up for lessons. So they signed me up for lessons. It took her a while to...
At 2?
Not at 2.
Okay.
I don't know if she was looking at 2 or at 3. I started about
Still,
like
that's
3 in 3 months or so,
Okay,
something like that.
yeah.
But
Almost 2, yeah.
but for a while there was not a teacher that would take someone that young. And eventually my first teacher, I was allowed to start with her once I was able to bow without falling over. And that was it, like a little past 3. But I started really early.
Great. And then so you study your whole time in...
No, I switched over to another teacher, Dr. Carol Leone at SMU in about 4th grade. So after I think it was about 6 years. And then I studied with her all the way through the end of high school.
Okay. And where did you go for your undergrad?
I did undergrad at Michigan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
In Ann Arbor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ann Arbor, yeah.
Yeah. Well, how was that experience?
I love Ann Arbor so much. It's one of my favorite places. And I think it's a really well-rounded school, and I loved being there. I think, I was hesitant about going into music coming out of high school, as I think a lot of people are, honestly. And I think being at a school that offered so many options like Michigan let me feel like, okay, if I want to do this, I can. There's a fantastic music school there, just as it is here. And if not, then I'm at this big state institution that I can explore other things and see what's going on and find my path that way. So I really loved it there.
So then what made you decide to come back here to Butler?
So I'd always, I knew Professor Nell for a very long time. I think he first judged me when I was like 13 or 12 or 11 in some of the Texas like MTNA or TMTA competitions. So I'd always had a good relationship with him, and he's someone that I'd wanted to study with, but for one reason or another, it hadn't worked out.
It's a hard studio to get into.
Hard studio to get into,
yeah,
and
yeah.
At certain times I didn't feel like the timing was right either. On my end, I wanted to get out of Texas for undergrad. It's anyone does. You want to explore somewhere else, right?
And then winter came.
Yeah, among other things. And I'd always also loved Austin, and I was like, okay, well, first and foremost, I think you choose your school for your teacher, and then I think especially as a grad student, you also choose your school for the area that it's in, because it needs to be, if you want to make a career, you have to be in an area that has a lot of possibilities, it has opportunities, right? It's hard to build up a career in a really small city. So between the professor and the location, and of course the school itself, without saying, is great. That I think just all came together. I thought it was a good fit, and I auditioned, and it ended up working out. So, yeah.
Very cool. What advice would you give to someone who was maybe in high school and looking at you and saying, that's amazing. Like, that's where, at your age, that's exactly where I want to be. I want to be playing a concerto with a major orchestra like Butler's Orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you do that?
I think, man, one piece of advice.
It could be multiple people.
Multiple, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's find the love for the music in whatever way that speaks to you. I think it's easy. I think especially for a lot of us in high school, I think a lot of people can deal with some burnout because there's so much going on, and also in college. And it's important to work really hard. But I think it's also important at the same time to recognize that there is more to life than music, which I think is something that people don't always like saying. And it's to work hard and practice hard and be smart, but also make sure that you maintain that love for the music. Because if you don't have that, I think first of all, it's really hard to play well if we're just talking strictly professional sense. But it's also, you're not going to have a fulfilling life if you're not enjoying what's the biggest part of your life, right? As a musician, you're doing music for most of it. So I think it's find that balance between work and life that works for you, and it's different for every person. And then run with that and see where it takes you.
And what did your undergrad and high school look like? Was it massive hours in the practice room, or how did you find that balance?
I think high school was hard. I
Because you're not in band. You're not in that
No, I
social
wasn't.
circle. Yeah.
No, I wasn't. But high school was hard because there's just a lot of school work in high school, and I was taking piano very seriously, and I just didn't have a lot of time. I didn't have much of a social life, and that's just how it goes sometimes. It's just how the cookie crumbles. If you're in high school, you're doing normal school, and then you're doing piano. Those are two separate things, and then they come together more in undergrad, right? There's a lot more overlap. But lots of hours, especially, in grad school, lots of hours in the practice room, definitely too many at some points, but everyone has to find their own balance for that. And I think I definitely went through periods where I was sitting in there for way too long, counterproductively, I would say. But I think I've hopefully found a decent balance at this point. And I think that's what it's all about, honestly. It has to be something sustainable, right? Sometimes you're going to have to push to an uncomfortable point, for sure. Like, you're in a big competition, man, you just got to put in a bunch of hours. And it's not always fun towards the end. It really isn't. But find the general arc of sustainability to work, I think, is something really important that has taken me a long time, but that I've kept searching for and gotten better and better at as I've gotten older.
Yeah. So yeah, and wonderful. So just wrapping it back to this concert, talk a little bit about that whole process, the audition process.
Yeah, so this year was an interesting competition because my sort of understanding of this is that often there's a first round and then a final round. But this year, there was just a final round due to the way that the applications fell. So a lot of times the first round you play cuts. You excerpt, let's say, I think it's like 20 minutes or something like that of your concerto, and you choose those and play it. But since there was no first round, as was announced right before the first round was going to happen, there was just a final round. So you play the whole concerto. And yeah, of course you can't, in this setting, play with the orchestra for the audition, right? So my teacher, Anton L., was kind enough to accompany me for the performance.
So he played the orchestra.
So he played the orchestra part, yes.
Yeah.
And of course he did a stellar job as a literal world-class musician.
Did he know that part, or did he?
He already knew it. I mean, okay. I played it. I think the first time.
It's surprising. I wouldn't expect him to know the orchestra parts.
He knows everything.
Okay.
No, but I come into him in lesson, and it's so funny because whenever the first time I played it for him it was like September or something like that. And I'm just like, yeah, can you play this with me? He's like, oh yeah, sure, I'm a little rusty. But then, he whips it out and it's like perfect, right? Like better than anyone I've ever had play that with me, I'd say. Like first try, and he's like, oh, that was horrible. And it's like, not at all. But so yeah, he played with me for the finals. And I ran through it a couple times with him in lesson. But yeah, you just, you play the concerto for the jury and then they decide. There's not much more to it than that because it was just a 1-round thing. But you prep it, you do the best of your ability, and then you go out there and you see how it goes, right?
And then when did you find out you made it?
Like an hour after I played. So it was just everyone played. Thank God. I hate waiting. Anyone who competes could tell you that like once the waiting goes, overnight, it starts to drag on you. There's but yeah, anyways,
and this was like September, October?
No, it was like I think it's December 2nd if my memory serves, second or third. Okay. So but yeah, everyone played, and then the judges met for a bit, and then they came out and announced, which is what you love to have as a competitor, so it doesn't weigh on you.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then what does your practice routine look like from December up until the
From December, yeah. So I think for me...
Because you've got other stuff going on.
I have a lot of other stuff going on. Yeah. So for me, I think something that I find really important for preparation is what I call cycling. The idea that, it's easy to be like, I'll just like practice this piece all the time until the performance, especially if it's a big performance. But things get stale, at least for me, when you do that. So I'll work on it for a bit. I'll set it aside, work on some other stuff that, I have a concert coming up in a couple weeks. I'll work on that stuff for a bit, set the Prokofiev aside, come back to it 2, 3, 4 weeks later. I think the brain does a lot of simmering, so to speak, when you put pieces away. And sometimes you're under the gun and you have to just practice it. But I know that I feel like my most enjoyable and genuine performances come through when the pieces had time to just properly stew and sit. So I try my best to work on it for a bit, set it aside, and then work on it for a bit, and then set it aside for a few weeks. And that way, to me, I think things get really solid, and they also stay fresh. Whereas if you're practicing it every day, it's probably pretty solid, but it's going to get really stale, and you get bored with it. or if you're not practicing, obviously that's not good either.
Yeah.
So to me, that's what I find the balance is sort of a waveform of prep. With this sort of cycling, you put it away. I have a somewhat rigid way that I do it, but it's that sort of wave, understanding when to put it away to keep it fresh and when it needs work.
Okay. And the last question. So like people who have never heard this piece, especially, you're going to come out and do something that looks superhuman, right? This piece, I mean, it's really impressive.
It does look very, very, yeah.
Yeah. So what are you doing 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 2 hours before you go on stage that day?
It depends on my day, right? Like in an ideal day, let's say where I have no hard commitments, before the performance, which is optimal, but often doesn't end up happening because life exists, right? But in an optimal world, usually what I like to do day of performance is I sort of actually miniature level of that sort of cycling thing I was talking to you about. I'll play through the piece pretty slowly, some amount of time before, 5-6 hours before ideally. If there's anything that feels a little iffy to me, that feels not so sure about that, work on that, hit it a couple times. But just play through the piece slowly, like with involvement, but not like honestly overly emotionally, because I want to save that sort of aspect for later.
Yeah.
But enough to where I'm engaged. Put it away, rest, eat, take 2-3 hours off, and then maybe let's say starting, depending on what the commute or whatever is like, right? Starting an hour or two before, then I will start warming up, hit whatever spots I'm a little worried about. And although a lot of times I actually warm up with a different piece because I feel like, okay, I've done what I need to do on the piece that I'm playing. Let's just play something else. I just need to keep my fingers moving. I don't want, sometimes you freak yourself out beforehand too.
Yeah.
You're like, what was that fingering, right? That's what I like to avoid happening, and it'll happen. But yeah, that's my ideal. Is like I run through it slowly, take care of anything that I feel like doesn't feel quite there, rest, nap if I can, eat, meditate, do something fun for myself, get dressed, warm up, and then play. But obviously that isn't always possible. Like sometimes you're in a competition, you play at 11 a.m. or sometimes you have a noon recital, right? Like, so there has to be flexibility to that. And this is an evening concert, so that makes that easy.
I think
on a Saturday.
You're even after intermission, I think.
Yeah, I'm after intermission. I believe it'll be pretty late, 8:30 or 9. I don't know the exact time, but that presents its own set of challenges, playing late, right?
Yeah.
But that's my ideal.
And then afterwards, do you go home and go to sleep, or do you just replay it?
Oh, God, no. If I could sleep, that'd be lovely. But yeah, no. I usually on nights with a big performance or a late performance, I'm usually up pretty late because it's spinning in my mind, Definitely like right after you finish, there's a huge adrenaline spike, and then I'm starving. Yeah, and then I have a bunch of food, and then I'm thinking about it, then I need to unwind, and before I know it, it's 2 a.m. So who knows when I'll go to bed.
Cool.
But, yeah.
And any family, friends coming down from DFW?
I'm sure my parents will. I don't know how many other people, but there could be. I'm not sure. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for
You're
coming in.
welcome.
And
it was my
can't wait
pleasure.
to hear the concerts.
Yeah, I'm so excited to play.